Welcome back to the channel. I am your host Tyrant, and in today's episode, well, it's not a regular episode of Screen Tested. Today is a little bit of a response video. Now I want to make this clear right from the outset. This is not a negative video, this is not an attacking video, this is none of the above. This is simply, I saw a video, I had a lot to say about it, so I thought, you know what, I'm just going to make a video about it so I can share my thoughts on it, because it's a bit interesting for the most part. Right, so the video that I'm talking about today is actually by a very large YouTuber called Mike Shake. He does similar sort of stuff to what I like to do for the most part. He likes weapons and likes kind of making them and testing them and stuff, so I love that. That's great. But his most recent video was I tried to make, I don't know what the exact title is, but it's basically, I created an invisible katana. So there's a lot here that's happening. So I'm going to go through it kind of step by step. I'm also maybe going to try and recreate some of the stuff and then put it to the test the same way that he did. However, I want to add that there is a lot of caveats to a lot of things for the most part, right? But let's just get started with today's episode. So starting off, if you're subscribed to this channel, you probably know that I have dealt with a lot of katanas over my time. More katanas than most people. I've used them to cut arrows in half, I've used them to smash steel barrels, I've used them to cut into stone. I've used a lot of katanas for a lot of different things. So I've put them through their paces. That's kind of where I come at this sort of, this sort of video from. I love katanas for the most part. They're a great sword. Not the best sword, but they are a very, very good sword. Probably the second best sword ever. I might have to cut that because that'll a lot of people. Now in his video he names it, I built a invisible katana, but if we're being honest here, now this is kind of a nitpick. I'll acknowledge this is a nitpick. It's not a katana. Like all the things that make up what a katana is, this is not that. It is just a curved piece of polycarbonate. It could just as easy be a falchion or, a saber. He uses katana because everybody loves katanas, it's more clickable, it's whatever. But it's not a katana, it's not any of those things either, I should mention. But anyway, just a little nitpick right off the bat. And you're probably wondering, well, what actually makes something like a katana? Well, that's a good question. For the most part, I would say something like a katana is a single-edged curved blade with a differential harden. I feel like that's an important part. So, getting into some of the nitty-gritty of Mike's videos. Starting off, he is going to be using polycarbonate sheeting to create his invisible katana. Now, polycarbonate is a material that I do have some experience with. It's actually more commonly used than most people would think, especially in this sort of arena. The first thing that comes to mind is lightsabers. Lightsaber blades are usually made out of polycarbonate tubing, and the reason why is really simple. It's actually pretty good in terms of its impact resistance for something like tubes and sparring with lightsabers. It also has some good light properties which makes blades really glow and all that sort of stuff. So polycarbonate does have some experience in this sort of realm in terms of, I'm going to use blade very liberally here because obviously this is not a blade, because a tube and a flat sheet are two different shapes entirely, obviously. Anyways, but yes, they are used for tubing in something like lightsabers. Pretty tough. But it's very different to use polycarbonate tubing for something like a lightsaber blade versus a flat sheet for like a sword blade. Two entirely different realms. Now this here is 10 millimeters thick of polycarbonate sheet. This is the biggest that I could get from my local hardware store, which I will be making some blades out of, and we will be putting them to our own tests. Now something to mention here is that his blade was actually thicker than this. His was 12 millimeters, which is pretty thick. Like there's not many swords out there that will be 10 millimeters thick, let alone 12 millimeters thick. So if you actually look at the cross section of something like a katana versus the blade that he made, or the blade that even I'll try to make, you can see that a katana has a much more refined blade geometry. It has a very large and very aggressive bevel tapering to a very sharp point. This is one of the, the virtues of something like a katana, and that's actually what gives it such a beautiful slicing and chopping motion, because of that blade geometry, which is also built upon the actual steel dynamics of something like a katana, for example, having a hardened edge with a soft core or or spine actually lends itself to this sort of blade, whereas something like polycarbonate doesn't have, obviously it doesn't have differential hardening. It's just a consistent thickness throughout the whole thing. One of the things that he starts off doing is buying a big piece of polycarbonate sheeting and then drawing out a blade shape and cutting it out. Now this is another nitpick that I wanted to talk about, because a katana falls within a specific, I would say, classification for the most part. A katana, on average, is roughly around 30 to 32 inches. It's a rather short sword for the most part. Then on top of that, the handle is usually 27 to 30 centimeters, something like that. Now, obviously these are averages. There are things that can fall outside of that. But for the most part, that's what your average katana is going to come at. But then when you get to something like an O-katana or a tachi, they're a little bit bigger. So I would actually say that the blade that he has created actually kind of falls into the tachi. Something that irks me, there's the best way to describe it, is if you make anything in a appropriate thickness or length, it's probably going to break through a lot of things just based on how thick something is. His blade is very thick, very wide, with relatively shallow bevels, especially compared to something like a real katana, and that just creates more of like a big stick to whack things. It doesn't actually cut or slice through anything for the most part that I could see in the video, at least. But don't worry, I'm going to be trying my own to show you guys. But anyway, back to the video. He then tries to test out the polycarbonate, and he basically just grabs a flat bit of polycarbonate, wedges it between two sawhorses that are not braced, and these sawhorses look very thin, if I'm being honest with you, and hits it with a sledgehammer. Now, the polycarbonate does have some good flexibility, which means this test isn't really testing anything, because first off, the sawhorses are the first things to break, and obviously they're going to get thrown out because the polycarbonate looks honestly thicker than the wood on the sawhorses. But this is just one of those things where it's like, I'm not really sure what you're supposed to be showing me here. I would have preferred something a little bit more destructive. To get a good gauge of a material that you're going to use for some sort of, let's say, destructive testing or some sort of project, it's good to actually push it to its limits to find out how it breaks, why it breaks, and what sort of stresses it can handle. Usually I've done this with a lot of things in terms of things like aluminum or steel or brass, so I don't have to do them every time I make something, because I already know what they can kind of handle and where they kind of lie in terms of their, what's going to actually break those sorts of materials. Polycarbonate is an interesting material because it is very strong. It's used for a lot of different purposes, but using it for a blade is where it gets interesting. Now, think of something like this, the lightsaber, right? It's a tube, meaning there's not really any hard edges around the whole thing, and obviously you can get different thicknesses of these blades. So when it connects with another lightsaber blade, another polycarbonate tube, there's no hard edges. However, something like a sword blade, when it actually comes in contact with, let's say another sword blade, you have two very sharp, very hard edges making contact, and this is where polycarbonate is. It's not good for this purpose, right? Which is why I wouldn't make a katana out of it for the most part, or any sword, really. But after he finishes the build process of his polycarbonate blade, he then takes it out to do some cut tests. Now, cut tests, I don't know if I'd call these cut tests. If I was to take this blade out for a cut test, for example, I would use a couple of different mediums. I would use water bottles, I would use pool noodles, or tatami. And the reason why I would use one of these three things is because it actually tests your edge alignment, your sharpness of your blade, and how well your blade can actually cut through some of those different mediums, right? He uses, I would say, softer targets. He uses fruits, things like that. Things where if you don't really have an edge, it will get through simply because you have a bevel. The bevel is actually doing a lot of the cutting here. There's not really an edge. Don't worry, we're going to get more into that very soon. Now, something interesting happens when he actually cuts into the pineapple, his first test. It breaks. The tang versus the blade actually snaps, and there's two kind of main reasons I think this is for. First off, he didn't round the shoulders from the blade to the tang, so that creates a weak point. And then on top of that, he added scales to the handle, which adds rigidity to the handle, but while the blade can still flex. And like I said, when polycarbonate flexes beyond its, its limit, it goes, right? Now, when it comes to the other cutting analogs, none of them particularly impressed me for the most part. The watermelon kind of seemed to just get smashed. The wood that he used, I'm going to assume it's some sort of pine. It looks like a pine. It's a very thin pine, like a normal sword could smash through that. And he had for the most part, a very large and long, thick polycarbonate blade with a bit of mass behind it. So smashing through that bit of pine doesn't particularly, impress me that much. When it comes to the brick, that's an interesting one. I actually went to my local hardware store when I got the polycarbonate to look for a similar brick, and I couldn't find any bricks. So that one I'm not going to comment on, just because I wanted to test that myself, but I couldn't find a brick, the same sort of brick and thickness and consistency and all that sort of stuff. But I think that's most of the video, and that's kind of where my thoughts are. If you make a blade-like object in appropriate thicknesses and lengths, you're going to be able to kind of smash through anything. For example, this here is a training katana, a bokken. This is made out of, I'm not sure what this one's made out of, maybe like a high-density polyethylene or polypropylene, whatever it is. Basically a plastic. It has some flex to it. It's just not clear. And this thing could smash through all of those things. So I'm not particularly impressed with this video, but that's not where this ends. I want to put my money where my mouth is for the most part, and I'm going to make a polycarbonate blade. Now, this is the biggest piece of polycarbonate that I can get. This thing costs like $60, expensive. So I'm not going to have the largest blades for the most part. They're going to be more knives. Let's call them short swords to be really generous here. But this is what I'm going to be making my polycarbonate blades out of. So that pretty much wraps up today's episode. As I said earlier, when polycarbonate goes, it really goes. Now, in terms of the results of this polycarbonate knife, they were pretty much identical to Mike's. Cutting the pumpkin, the bevel really does most of the heavy lifting, and the same thing with the pineapple. They're not really tests for that sort of thing, because this thing isn't sharp. Like, this thing against the foam, as you guys saw, could do nothing. So it's not actually that sharp. It's more the bevel and, speed and power. But then the moment you put it up against another edge, for example, like a sword edge, it takes out massive chunks and then just completely obliterates it. And that's because you're putting a hard edge against a hard edge. And polycarbonate isn't really good for that sort of thing. Something that I have been interested in testing at some point randomly is how would a lightsaber blade that's made of polycarbonate but in a tube, a cylindrical form, how that would go against an actual blade or the edge of a blade. But that's for something later, nothing for now. But that's all for today's episode. I hope you enjoyed. Remember, this is all just lighthearted. I just had some thoughts on this particular video that I saw. Check out Mike's channel. Well, who might say? You guys know who Mike Shake is. Check out his channel here. It's got a bunch of cool content, fun content, a bunch of similar sort of content that I do. But that's going to be all for today. Thanks for watching, guys. I genuinely hope you enjoyed. Remember to like and subscribe. And as always, I'll see you in another video. Have a good one.